All right, Section 8, irrigation scheduling. Now, this section you're going to have to pay close attention to because it does have a lot of math in it. Now, it's not super complex math, but it will take you some time to kind of get familiar with the concepts and then walk through the steps one by one. And we'll go over all these steps. I'll reiterate the concepts on a number of times as we go through it. It's also helpful to have the QWEL audit form out. The QWEL audit form does a great job of walking through these formulas in a sequential basis. Please do have that QWEL audit formula out. All right, our learning objectives. We want to understand the concept of irrigation scheduling. We want to know how to determine irrigation runtime. We want to know how to develop an irrigation schedule. And we'll talk about tools to assist with monitoring and adjustment. So here's section 1, irrigation scheduling, the concepts behind it. We do want to understand the importance of basic irrigation scheduling for programming both conventional controllers and WBICs. Irrigation scheduling involves the development of a plan for the operation of the irrigation system, so it's important to understand irrigation scheduling in order to program both types of controllers. The weather-based irrigation controllers aim to manage the application of landscape water by automatically adjusting the irrigation schedule to closely match changes in ETO based upon site-specific conditions. Restart. In order to effectively program a WBICS, it's necessary to have an understanding of how an irrigation schedule for a conventional controller is determined. There's an inherent complexity to maintaining healthy landscapes. The procedures provided give you a starting point for an irrigation schedule. For example, some of the things you need to take into account are hydrozones that have different water use species on the same hydrozone, microclimates that are in your irrigation system, seasonal changes. We always have to be conscious of seasonal changes. All these things need to be taken into account when you're setting up an irrigation schedule. And essentially what we do is we use irrigation scheduling to help us manage the application of water. So it's not an exact science. The calculations used to determine an irrigation schedule provide a starting point for the water manager, but the schedules will need to be modified depending upon the observed results. When preparing an irrigation schedule, the water manager is required to make decisions about various elements, including how long to irrigate each zone, which is the station runtime. If runoff occurs, it may be necessary to split the runtime to allow water applied to infiltrate into the soil, which we call cycle and soak. What time of day do we want to operate the irrigation system? So that's related to the cycle start time. How many days each week do we want to operate the irrigation system? So that's our frequency of irrigation. And the different types of plant materials have different water requirements and root depths. Thus, they require separate irrigation programs. So these are all things that we need to take into account when we're setting up our irrigation schedule. I left this chart in here. CIMMYS is California's version of AZMET. It's their state climate system. The trends we see in this chart are basically the same ones that we see here in Arizona. So this figure shows a chart of weekly ETO for the months of March to October, which is the gray line. The orange line represents a typical residential irrigation pattern. The yellow area represents the under irrigation, and the blue represents over irrigation. The goal of the water manager is to match irrigation to the ETO line. So we don't want to underwater like we're seeing here between March and April, and we don't want to overwater like we're seeing here between April and June, and then again from July through October. All the blue areas overwatering, all the yellow areas underwatering. A proper and good water manager is going to try to stay as close to the weekly ETO line as possible. These two graphs are from our WaterFluent software system. They show the same basic curve as on the previous slide. The green line is the HOA's water budget. The blue line is their water use. So you can see for both HOAs that they were slow to increase water use in the spring, and then they way overshot in the summer, fall, and winter. Ultimately, they both had almost double the water use compared to their budget. So this is what proper planning and scheduling can prevent, is this overuse of water. The goal of the water manager is to maintain soil moisture below field capacity, but above wilting point. So we want it in that fine line area here. So we want it basically in this section here. So we want to maintain soil moisture below field capacity, but above that permanent wilting point. The concept of management allowable depletion, or MAD, determines how much the water manager allows soil moisture to be depleted before refilling the reservoir by irrigating. Typically, we use an MAD of 50%. Both water management and irrigation scheduling does require knowledge about soil type and plant material root depth. That's why we went into detail on some of those areas. In order to irrigate the root zone properly, the water manager must know the root depth of the plants within the hydro zone. Plants with shallow roots require more frequent irrigation with a less total run time, like turfgrass and annuals. Plants with deep roots require less frequent irrigation with longer run times, so, for example, large shrubs and trees. In order to achieve the required total run time, the use of multiple start times, like a cycle and soak, may be needed in order to minimize water waste due to runoff. As noted in Section 3, the soil type also plays an important role in irrigation scheduling. For sandy soils, you're going to need to apply smaller amounts of water more often, or more days per week, due to the lower water holding capacity. For clayey soils, you're going to need to apply larger amounts of water more slowly, so with slower precipitation rate and cycle and soak, and you're going to do it less frequently, so less days per week, so to basically prevent runoff and allow time for air to return to the soil. When programmed and installed correctly, WBICs are able to automatically adjust the irrigation schedule to water only when the soil moisture reaches the MAD threshold. However, conventional controllers require manual adjustment to deliver sufficient water to the landscape and replace that water loss to the evapotranspiration. Irrigation runtime. How do we know how to determine it? You can see here on this page a copy of the QWEL irrigation audit form. The audit form lays out all the scheduling calculations in a logical manner, so make sure you have this form out as we go through all these calculations. Let's talk about the first one, the plant water requirement, or PWR. This is the demand side of our supply and demand equation, so to speak. The plant water requirement, it's similar to our landscape water budget that we talked about before, but this is expressed in inches rather than a number of gallons for a given area. The first step to developing an irrigation schedule is to understand how much water the plants in the landscape need. So you're going to multiply the ETO by the plant factor to determine the plant water requirement in inches. Choosing daily, weekly, or monthly ETO will determine whether you calculate a daily, weekly, or monthly runtime. Most conventional irrigation controllers operate on a weekly schedule, so it might be most useful to determine the weekly runtime. The runtime multiplier is similar to dividing by the irrigation efficiency as for the landscape water requirement that we talked about in Section 4. However, the DULQ is used because it can be easily measured, whereas the irrigation efficiency, or IE, is more difficult to measure. The other components of the runtime multiplier formula are designed to reflect the fact that water moves laterally within the soil. Simply dividing by DULQ would therefore overestimate the amount of water needed. As we talked about previously, we know that irrigation systems are not efficient. So because of that inefficiency, we need to add in a multiplier so that we can get the proper watering number. The runtime multiplier is used to determine the maximum amount of water to apply to a hydrozone to maintain plant health, given that the irrigation system does not deliver water in a perfectly uniform manner. The runtime multiplier results in a lower maximum amount of water than simply dividing by the DULQ to reflect that there is lateral movement of water in the soil. So in other words, we use the runtime multiplier to compensate for irrigation system inefficiencies and not waste excessive amounts of water if we were to do the calculation by just dividing by the distribution uniformity low quarter. So the irrigation water requirement is similar to irrigation water calculated in Section 4, but it's expressed in inches rather than the number of gallons for a given area. So typically, we would use a rain sensor in lieu of factoring the effective precipitation into the schedule, because a rain sensor is going to have more accurate data. To get the irrigation water requirement, we're going to multiply that plant water requirement by the runtime multiplier. So essentially, we're going to take the plant needs or the plant water requirement and adjust for the irrigation system inefficiencies to figure out how much irrigation water we need to apply. That's essentially what this formula is saying. So the plant water requirement and the irrigation water requirement provide the water manager with a range within which to work. This recognizes the actual amount of water to maintain plant health may vary due to microclimate and other factors that we talked about before. The PWR and IWR are measured in inches and so provide a minimum and a maximum amount of water to be applied to the hydrozone to maintain plant health. And the water manager should generally apply water within this minimum and maximum range. If you irrigate closer to the plant water requirement, this may result in some stress to plants in the hydrozone area. If you're irrigating closer to the irrigation water requirement, this should provide adequate water for healthy plant growth and account for irrigation system inefficiencies. So you might be asking, well, why would I want to do anything near the PWR if it results in some stress to the hydrozone? An example of this is turf grass. So we might have turf grass in a median area along a highway that does not need to be irrigated that well, and so we could get away with having a little bit of stress to that turf grass because nobody really cares about that turf grass in a median area or in a non-functional turf space. However, if it's an athletic field, they're going to want to irrigate closer to the IWR because we want that turf grass to be high quality. Same thing for like golf courses as well. Any high quality turf, you're going to want to have water application closer to the irrigation water requirement and not the plant water requirement. Plant water requirement is just basically what does that plant need to keep it alive. So we're going to use a formula to determine the minimum and maximum irrigation runtime so we can translate the PWR and the IWR from inches into minutes. The minimum irrigation runtime, or the IRT min, is determined by dividing the plant water requirement, PWR, by the precipitation rate, PR, determined in an irrigation audit. And then we multiply it by 60 to convert this to minutes. The irrigation runtime max-min, or IRT max, is determined by dividing the irrigation water requirement, or IWR, by the precipitation rate determined in an irrigation audit, and then multiplying that by 60 to convert into minutes. So we have an example of weekly runtime here. And this has 4 different hydrozones. So we have a low water use shrubs on a drip line. We have moderate shrubs on a drip line. We have cool season turf grass with rotating sprinklers, and then we have cool season turf grass with fixed spray sprinklers. And here's all of our data about it. We have our plant factors, our DULQ from an audit, we have our precipitation rate from an audit, and then we have our time to runoff also from an audit. So this is all the information that you would be getting from an audit. The plant factor, of course, we know from books and charts. I left SIMBIS Zone 5 in here. It's just same thing as AZ Met, just a zone within California. The main important thing is the peak monthly ETO of 6.51 inches in July. That translates to a weekly ETO of 1.47. You should know that to calculate a weekly ETO, you don't just take the monthly one and divide by 4. That would be inaccurate. You take the monthly one. So in this case, we have an ETO of 6.51 inches in July. So you take 6.51 and you divide by the number of days in the month. So July happens to have 31 days. So you would divide 6.51 by 31 to come up with a daily ETO. And then you'd multiply that daily ETO by 7 to get the 1.47 inches in the weekly ETO. So if it's a month in June, then you would divide it by 30. If it's February, you would divide by 28. Again, monthly ETO divided by the number of days in that month will get you a daily ETO, and then multiply that by 7 to get the weekly ETO if that calculation is ever asked. Again, here we're looking at weekly ETOs. Here's our plant water requirement formula. It's the weekly ETO times the plant factor. We know that our weekly ETO is 1.47. Our plant factor for those low water use shrubs is 0.3. So our plant water requirement is 0.44. So here's our runtime multiplier. We already seen this equation. It's 1 divided by 0.4 plus the quantity 0.6 times the DULQ. Now remember, these brackets, if there's multiple variables within a bracket, we have to follow what is called the order of operations, and we're going to be doing the variables in the parentheses first. Always do the variables in the parentheses first. So 0.6 times 0.9 is 0.54. Then we add on the 0.4. People always miss this step. So 0.4 plus 0.54 is 0.94, and then we divide that into 1. So 1 divided by 0.94 is 1.06. 1.06. And then our irrigation water requirement is taking our plant water requirement and then adjusting for the irrigation efficiencies using the runtime multiplier. So our plant water requirement is 0.44. We multiply that by the runtime multiplier, and that gives us 0.44 inches of water that should be applied. So notice the difference here. Now, because this is low water use shrubs and they don't use a whole lot of water, there's not much of a difference in the application in terms of the plant water requirement versus the irrigation water requirement. If this was like a high water use area, then you would see a significant difference between the amount of water applied in inches from the plant water requirement and the irrigation water requirement as applied in inches. Here's example weekly runtime. So we're going to continue calculations for the low water use shrub hydrozone. So again, we're going to find out the irrigation runtime minimum and the irrigation runtime maximum. So the minimum is basically, what does the plant need? Here's what the plant needs, our plant water requirement. We're going to take a precipitation rate from our audit. So in this case, we have 0.44 divided by our precipitation rate obtained from the audit, which is 0.5. And we're going to multiply that by 60. So we come up with 53 minutes. Our irrigation runtime maximum is going to be our irrigation water requirement, which again was adjusted by the system inefficiencies. So irrigation runtime maximum, we're going to divide that by the precipitation rate obtained in an audit and multiply it by 60 to get the minutes. So for our irrigation water requirement, that's 0.47 divided by 0.5 times 60, and we get 56 minutes. Now again, because we're dealing with this low water use hydrozone, the difference between the irrigation runtime minimum and the irrigation runtime maximum is not going to be that different. It's basically 3 minutes. Again, you would see higher values in higher water use hydrozones. So this chart, which is the weekly runtime chart, and we're looking at weekly irrigation runtimes for all 4 hydrozones. So we're going to figure out the weekly IRT minimum and maximum for the moderate shrubs, the cool season turf grass on rotating sprinklers, and the cool season turf grass on fixed space sprinklers. A couple of them you're going to have to do on your own. The rotating sprinklers and the fixed space sprinklers you can do on your own. But let's go forward. Okay, weekly irrigation runtimes for all 4 hydrozones. So how do we calculate weekly ET? I had mentioned that to you before. You're going to use the monthly ETO, divide by the number of days per month, and then multiply by 7. That's the only way you're going to be able to get the weekly ETO. And that's where we came up with this 1.47. So on this chart, our weekly runtimes are shown for the 4 different hydrozones, ranging from low water use shrubs irrigated with inline drip, all the way over to the cool season turf grass irrigated with these fixed space sprinklers. So the 2 numbers shown for each weekly runtime are the minimum and then the maximum IRT. The difference between the minimum and maximum IRT is typically only a few minutes if the DU is relatively high, since the runtime multiplier is close to 1. The difference between the minimum and maximum IRT is larger when the DU LQ is relatively low and when the application rate is relatively low, as much as 30 minutes in the examples provided. July is the peak watering month, so low water use shrubs with inline drip use 53 to 56 minutes per week. Moderate shrubs with inline drip will require 88 to 94 minutes per week. Cool season turf grass with rotating sprinklers will require 141 to 172 minutes per week. And cool season turf grass with fixed spray sprinklers will require 47 to 62 minutes per week. Okay, irrigation scheduling, knowing how to develop an irrigation schedule. In order to use the irrigation runtime calculated to program the controller, it's also necessary to determine how many days to water, how long to water each day, how many start times to use, and at what time of day to irrigate. And these are all things that the water manager does. So again, we want to follow along using QWEL audit form. In order to make these decisions, the water manager must understand the limitations of the controller as well as the requirements of the landscape. For example, how long does it take before runoff occurs? It's important to know. How many start times and programs does the controller have available? It's also, is it possible to run more than one program at a time? And does the irrigation system have sufficient pressure to run more than one valve at a time? Does the controller have a cycle and soak option? How deep are the plant's roots in each hydrozone? What's the infiltration rate of the soil? If you're using overhead spray, you might want to avoid irrigating when it's typically windy and during the heat of the day in order to avoid water loss due to evaporation. All right, the number of days to irrigate. So you can see that this chart is really kind of dependent upon the weather and the ETO. So here we have a cool weather suggestions for less than 0.5 inches per week ETO. Warm weather, ETO 0.6 to 1, and then hot weather with an ETO of 1 inch, of greater than 1 inch per week. And it's classified by turf grass, annuals, perennials, and shrubs and trees. So this table, it basically provides general recommendations for mature plants. And it's important to know that this is for mature plants. And there could very well be valid reasons to deviate from this table. This table is intended to provide general recommendations for mature plants. There's definitely valid reasons to deviate from the table. But ultimately, it provides recommendations for a number of days per week to irrigate. And the number of days to water is a management decision that must be made by the water manager. And it's a function of many factors such as the desired appearance of the hydrozone, the drought tolerance and preferred soil moisture content of the plants in the hydrozone, the root depth of the plant material, which is likely to be a function of the soil type and condition, and also the available watering window. We don't have to worry so much about watering windows here in Arizona, but certainly in California, they do have watering windows at set days a week and set times that they can water. For our area, these are our landscape watering guidelines. This is in Landscape Watering by the Numbers. The Landscape Watering by the Numbers book is our regional Bible for landscape watering, and this is the Landscape Watering Guidelines. We are updating it right now. I'm sitting on the committee to help update this, but ultimately what I want to call your attention to is that it has two different types of plant types under each category of vegetation. So for trees, for example, we have desert adapted and high water use. And the interesting thing here for desert adapted trees, note that in the summer, in the heat of the summer, those trees only need to be watered once every 7 days to once every 21 days in the heat of the summer, if they are at the correct root depth. So we want to water deeply. Ideally, we want to get 24 to 36 inches down. And by doing that, we're creating a water reservoir within the soil, and that helps the plants live a lot longer. Of course, high water use plants, then we're going to need to water more often. But I just wanted to point out, they only need to be watered once per week to once every 3 weeks, even in the hottest times of the summer if they're watered correctly. On this chart, we have the number of days per week to irrigate. And that was directly related to that chart that talked about the ETO, selecting the date range or the frequency range based upon the ETO. So the number of days per week to irrigate is based upon the ETO level. If it's a low ETO, then you don't need to water as often. If it's a very high ETO, like something greater than 1, then you're going to need to irrigate more often. In this case, we're assuming that the irrigation controller operates with a weekly schedule, so the minimum irrigation frequency possible is once per week. So again, the minimum irrigation frequency possible is 1 per week. Some controllers don't have this limitation, and you can have a monthly schedule that allows for less frequent irrigation cycles and a deeper application of water. For large established plants and trees, this encourages deeper root establishment and therefore a healthier plant or tree. The frequency for the low water use shrubs is selected as 1 day per week for all months from April to October. The ideal frequency for the low water use plants may well be once every 2 weeks or less if the controller were capable of such a schedule. The frequency for the moderate shrubs is selected as 1 day per week in April and October and 2 days per week during the hotter months. The frequency for the cool season turf grass is selected as 2 days per week in October, 3 days in April, May, August, and September, and 4 days in the hottest months of June and July. Daily runtime. So to get the daily runtime, we're going to divide the weekly irrigation runtime by the number of days to irrigate to determine the daily runtime. And that's all in the formula. Daily runtime equals weekly irrigation runtime divided by the number of days to irrigate. So here's an example. So for our low water use shrubs example, so we have a daily irrigation runtime. So our daily irrigation runtime is our weekly irrigation runtime minimum divided by the number of days to irrigate. So we already decided we're going to only irrigate once a week. So it's 53 minutes divided by 1. So that's 53 minutes per week. And the maximum is 56 divided by 1. So that is 56 minutes. So if we want to look at a separate example, again, starting with our ETO of 1.47, here's our inline drip, plant factor 0.5, DULQ 0.9, precipitation rate 0.5. Our daily irrigation runtime minimum and our runtime maximum is 88 and 94. Looking at that chart, the number of days to irrigate, we've got an ETO that's higher than 1. It's 1.47. So for our shrubs, the suggested amount of time to irrigate is 2 to 4 days per week. And so we're going to select as a management decision 2 days per week to irrigate. And we have our daily run times at 88 and 94 for irrigation runtime minimum. Irrigation runtime maximum is 88 and 94. If we figure out what our daily irrigation runtime would be, is our weekly divided by the 2 days that we decided to irrigate. So that leaves 44 minutes for our daily irrigation runtime. And then at the minimum, and then our daily irrigation runtime maximum is 94 divided by 2, or 47 minutes. So again, we have to round up for these things. Now let's talk about cycles per day. Our cycles per day equals the daily irrigation runtime divided by the time to run off. So that's our limiting factor, right? Anything that's just to run off the property, then we're just wasting water. So we need to make sure that our daily irrigation time is always at or less than the runoff time. And then we round up to the next whole level. People always forget to round up doing some of these calculations, so be sure to round up. So let's take a look. Going back to our low water use shrubs example, here's our cycles per day, our daily run time, irrigation run time, divided by the time to run off. So that's 2 cycles per day. And here's our daily irrigation runtime max. So daily irrigation runtime max is 56 minutes divided by 30. So that's 2. We got 2 cycles per day for both of those. And then here's our calculations for the moderate use shrub hydrozone. So our cycles per day, daily runtime minimum divided by the time to runoff. So 44 minutes irrigation runtime minimum divided by 30 minutes to runoff gives us 2 cycles per day. Same thing for the daily runtime maximum divided by the runoff time. So it's 47 divided by 30. Again, we have 2 cycles per day. Now we have all our cycles filled out for our minimum and maximum cycles per day. This is all filled out for this sheet. Now we should point out that the number of cycles required for the cool season turfgrass irrigated with fixed spray sprinklers is 3 to 4 cycles due to the short time to runoff for 5 minutes. And that's because the precipitation rate for the fixed spray sprinklers is much higher than the precipitation rate for rotating sprinklers. So we have shorter runoff times and therefore need to do more of a cycles and soak schedule. As the water manager, you need to leave sufficient time between the cycles for the water applied to infiltrate to the soil. If there's more cycles than the irrigation controller is capable of running, then the water manager will need to adjust the number of days to irrigate and the daily run time of the schedule. Alternatives to overcome the number of start times available on the controller and ensure that the water reaches the desired root depth include cycle and soak if available, or using 2 programs to double the number of start times. And next is run time per cycle. So we want to divide the daily run time by the number of cycles per day to determine the run time per cycle. So run time per cycle, daily irrigation runtime divided by the cycles per day. That's all pretty straightforward. Most of this stuff is pretty straightforward. Again, if you follow along that irrigation audit form, it puts everything in sequence. So the numbers that you calculate at the beginning drive the calculations afterwards. So everything is done sequentially. So runtime per cycle min and then runtime per cycle max. Daily irrigation runtime minimum divided by the number of cycles per day. So we're back to the 53 minutes divided by 2 is 27 minutes. The maximum, 56 minutes divided by 2, and that's 28 minutes. So you can see, again, only a 1 minute difference between the min and the max when you actually get to the runtime. And for our moderate water use shrubs, same kind of thing. We had said 44 minutes for the daily irrigation runtime divided by 2 cycles per day. So we want to run it 22 minutes per runtime cycle, and the runtime cycle max is 47 divided by 2, or 24 minutes. Again, not a big difference between the 22 and the 24 minutes. And then here is our runtime cycle chart all completely filled out. So if you went forward and did these other calculations, these would be the numbers of min and max runtimes per cycle. All right, management decisions. So finally, after we get all this information, we want to select the appropriate start times, days to irrigate, and the program for each hydrozone. Hydrozones with the same number of days to irrigate and the same number of irrigation cycles per day can go on the same program. So in this example, 4 programs could be used using multiple start times for each hydrozone, or we could put 3 programs could be used by putting the 2 turf grass zones on one program and using cycle and soak as an alternative to multiple start times. The start time and days to irrigate should be selected by the water manager in agreement with the owner or the user of the landscape. Overhead spray is typically best to operate just before or around sunrise when the winds tend to be lower and the atmosphere and the soil surface are cooler to minimize water loss to evaporation. Care should be taken not to operate overhead spray when it's excessively windy, so make sure you check local watering restrictions as well. So irrigation scheduling is an iterative process. It's never, one and done. We have to have seasonal adjustments, and then there are adjustments based upon weather. So there's a lot of monitoring and adjustments that need to be done. Once the irrigation schedule is in operation, it is an essential component of water management to continually monitor each hydrozone and make necessary adjustments over time. So we want to monitor the soil moisture at the appropriate root depth for each hydrozone. We talked about using a soil probe to do that. Sometimes there might be soil sensors in turf areas that can help us with that. There are a number of ways to monitor soil moisture. Also, we might need to reduce runtime if soil appears excessively moist and to also limit excessive vegetation growth. Or on the opposite side, we might have to increase runtime if soil appears excessively dry or the plants are showing signs of drought stress. This figure displays the steps we just went through as a continuous cycle. So we're starting off with calculating our minimum and maximum weekly irrigation runtime. We figure out the number of days to irrigate. We figure out our daily runtime. We figure out how many cycles per day we want our controller to run. And then we figure out how much runtime per cycle we want to run. And then we start to make those decisions about start time, days a week to operate and irrigate. And then we get to the point where we're monitoring and adjusting these things over time, depending upon weather conditions, seasons, visible observations, maybe some repair issues that come up. So monitoring and adjusting is an important part of scheduling. Once the irrigation schedule is in operation, it's an essential component of water management to continually monitor each hydrozone and make the necessary adjustments over time. So we want to monitor the soil moisture at the appropriate root depth for each hydrozone. We want to reduce runtimes if soil appears excessively moist and to limit excessive vegetative growth. We want to increase runtimes if soil appears excessively dry or if plants are showing signs of drought stress. Tools to assist with monitoring and adjustment. So we talked about some of these before, but remember our soil probe. This is the turf soil probe we talked about. If you're doing drip, we also have the long shank screwdriver or just the kind of the basic soil probe. So we want to check the soil moisture. We want to check the depth of the soil moisture. We want to check the root depths. Just remember, regardless of the technology that's in place, there's really no substitute for the expertise and observation of the water manager. Being able to identify saturated soils or drought-stress plants are skills that are difficult to replace with automation and technology. Even simple tools like a soil probe can reveal what's going on underneath the surface and help diagnose irrigation issues. And the soil probe is probably the easiest method of determining what's happening by checking the soil moisture, checking the depth of the soil moisture, and checking the root depth of plants. So if properly programmed, WBICS can offer an excellent return on investment due to potential water savings and the time saved in manually adjusting controllers throughout the seasons. So WBICS, as we mentioned, have the ability to adapt to changing weather conditions much more rapidly than conventional controllers. And because of that, they can save the water manager a considerable amount of time. We want to make sure that the WBICS are EPA WaterSense label. You got to look for this little label on them, because that means that we know that they are water efficient. They are at least 20% more water efficient than the original controllers, than the regular conventional controllers. But we also need to carefully program them to operate properly. So sensors for irrigation controllers do interrupt the irrigation schedule in response to specific site conditions like rain or high winds, things like that. We're going to talk more about sensors and controller in Section 9, irrigation controllers, coming up. Local water utilities often publish watering schedules that can be a great starting point for developing an irrigation schedule. We don't have so much here, but I would not be surprised that if in the future we actually start going to watering schedules that we'll have to follow. Kind of depends upon the source of the water and what that water provider wants to do. All right, here we are, irrigation scheduling review questions. In this case, we've got 2 pages of them, 13 different questions. Be sure you can answer every one of these questions. If you can't, reach out and we'll try to work through it together. All the information should be in this chapter. I would also encourage you to go through those 4 examples of the different plant types and hydrozones and run through all these calculations on your own. Make sure that you fully understand these. This will be on the test. It's going to be part of the audit. So we really need you to understand all the concepts that was put into this in this chapter specifically. With that, let's get ready to go on to our final lesson, Section 9, which is on irrigation controllers.